Hello family, my name is Chris, I am your home gamer dad, and if you're familiar with Power Rangers Heroes of the Grid, a game I frequently show off on this channel, then today I will be showing off the next game that uses the Renegade Games Guardian system. It plays extremely similar to Heroes of the Grid, has a lot of the same mechanics, but also its own uniqueness, which is what I will be talking to you about today as I go over G.I. Joe Mission Critical. Specifically, the Universal Deployment System, which was introduced in this, the vehicles that the Joes use, and then of course the epic crossover between G.I. Joe and Power Rangers when you mix together Mission Critical and Power Rangers Heroes of the Grid. So this isn't a full tutorial for this game because it shares so many similarities to Heroes of the Grid. I'll be talking about those as I go through the actual tutorial, discussing with you guys the main key points of the Universal Deployment System, something that I hope to see more of going forward, not only with Mission Critical, but other Guardian System games. The vehicles, which are unique to the Joes, and then of course, how to combine together your Power Ranger games with the G.I. Joe game here in order to have this really cool ability to have like Jason and Duke take down Rita and Cobra Commander and all that awesome stuff. Let's head on over to that tutorial so this is where we can fight back against Cobra and save the world. Yo, Joe! As mentioned before, G.I. Joe Mission Critical is the second in the Guardian System games from Renegade Game Studios. In it, 1 to 5 players take control of a hero from the elite organization codenamed G.I. Joe as they defend the world against Cobra, a ruthless terrorist organization. Using their gear, skills, wit, and vehicles, the Joes fight back against hordes of foot soldiers, strong lieutenants, fierce nemesis enemies, and ultimately the final boss. Wherever there's trouble, G.I. Joe, and possibly the Power Rangers, are there. Just like Heroes of the Grid, Mission Critical's board consists of 1 command center, called the Pit here, surrounded by 4 wedges representing different locations. In Heroes of the Grid, each one of the foot soldiers is actually tied to 2 locations, meaning that if you use a specific type of foot soldier, you have to use the location that belongs to that enemy. In Mission Critical, they use the Universal Deployment System, which allows you to use any 2 foot soldiers and any 4 locations. For now, I'm just going to be using the components that came with Mission Critical, but when I go over the crossover part of this later, I'll show you exactly how easy it is to incorporate any Heroes of the Grid location and foot soldiers into the mix. But for now, you're going to take your 4 wedges and your center piece, your command center, in this case, again, it is called the Pit, and arrange it as you normally would in the circle format. You're then going to take the 4 location hex tokens, randomly shuffle them together, and you're going to place them in each location around the pit. These symbols are going to determine the locations where foot soldiers are going to be placed during the deployment phase. You're going to have this deck of cards here that will show each one of these tokens as you flip through it, and each of these tokens does represent something. So if this goes on a location, that means there's a secret base in that location, research lab, etc., etc., etc. These really don't mean much of anything other than flavor, and again, to determine where the foot soldiers are going to go during the deployment phase. So once again, I have all 4 in my hand. I'll just take a shuffle them together. Doesn't really matter. And we'll put 1 here. We'll take another one and we'll put it, all right, so the Global Summit will go here. We'll take a secret base at the Cobra Temple and a military base at the Space Station Delta. And again, these will be different every time you play. So already within the Universal Deployment System, you have 2 different forms of randomization before you even get to placing foot soldiers. The 4 locations that you have and what order you choose to place them in, and then the 4 location tokens that represent where each one of the foot soldiers will land when you start flipping through the deck. You're then going to find the stack of the 20 Universal Deployment card deck. These cards show one of the 4 location hexes that you placed along the side of the board, along with different symbols on the other side. You're either going to get 1 to 3 symbols here, either of yellow Cobra symbols or red Cobra symbols. You're going to take these 20 cards, you're going to shuffle them together, and just like you would expect from Heroes of the Grid, you're going to divide these into 4 equal piles. Again, exactly as you would in Heroes of the Grid. So we can do 1, 2, 3, 4, and then you're just going to go ahead and do that for each one of these piles. You can probably know what we're going to be doing after this if you are a veteran to Heroes of the Grid. But for those that are not, here's what we do next. Again, in the same vein as Heroes of the Grid, you're going to be marking these piles A, B, C, and D. Pile A will stay the way that it is. You're not going to add anything to it. You're not going to shuffle around. It is just as it is. Piles B and C are going to get shuffled in various lieutenants into the game. Depending on which ones you have, you're going to choose one lieutenant and shuffle it directly into the deck. So we can just take this, shuffle it around and in here so it'll appear randomly. And then same thing for over here. So now the lieutenant is randomly shuffled into decks B and C. Instead of lieutenants, you may want to play with nemesis cards, which are harder versions of lieutenants. Instead of having two lieutenants, you would have one lieutenant in one of these piles, and then you would shuffle in your nemesis card into the other. Those are interchangeable. You can have a lieutenant in this card and the nemesis in this one. If you happen to have two nemesis cards, you can shuffle one nemesis into here and one nemesis into here. Basically, piles B and C will each have either one lieutenant or one nemesis randomly shuffled into it. So this way, as you go through the game, they will appear at some point in one of the locations and your Joes will have to take them out. Finally, in pile D, you're going to take the boss card for whoever it is that you're going to be fighting this game and shuffle them into it exactly in the same way as you would for Heroes of the Grid, not knowing where it's going to appear, not knowing what boss is going to show up. You can, as always, with the lieutenants, nemesis, and bosses, either choose them randomly from whatever you have in your collection or handpick them to determine what type of game that you specifically want to play. After you're done shuffling in your lieutenants, nemesis, and boss cards, you're then going to make your deployment deck. You're going to start with pile D, leaving it right here on the bottom. You're going to take C, put it on top of D. You're going to take B, put it on top of C, and then you're going to take A and finally put that on top. You will no longer be shuffling this. This is going to stay the exact same way it is for at least the first 4 rounds of the game. And again, this is exactly as you would expect from Heroes of the Grid. The difference is that, as mentioned before, it's all about the location tokens, those hex tokens that we placed on them. It doesn't matter what foot soldiers you're playing with, these 20 cards, along with the lieutenants, nemesis, and boss cards that you're adding, will always be used for every game you play, no matter what locations or foot soldiers you have. Speaking of foot soldiers, you're going to want to choose 2 to play against for the game. For this example, we're just going to be using the ones that come with the Mission Critical Core box, which are the Cobra Troopers and the Crimson Guards. I think there's an expansion coming out later that has another foot soldier that you can choose from. And of course, once you start crossing over, you have a lot more choices that way. So you're going to want to find the red Cobra token and the yellow Cobra token, and you're going to assign one of these tokens to each one of your foot soldiers. So for this example, I choose to have the red Cobra symbol represent the Crimson Guards, while the yellow are the Cobra Troopers. This can easily be reversed. This does not have to be done this way. If you wish, you could have the red ones on the Cobra Troopers and the yellow ones on the Crimson Guard. This is another one of those choices that you're going to make in the beginning of the game that will always make your game unique. No matter what side you choose, this will always determine which Cobra Trooper or Crimson Guard or Foot Soldier, whatever you're using, will appear on the board as you flip over the deployment deck. All other setup for the remainder of Mission Critical is the same as you would expect from Heroes of the Grid. So again, if you want to go check that out when I do my solo playthrough to learn how you set up for a solo mode, go ahead and check that. But generally, each player is going to choose the hero that they're going to play as, the 10 card stack of their combat cards. You're going to shuffle them and leave them close because you're going to draw them later. However many action tokens they're going to need for the game, along with an energy that they can use for their character. Also, again, for the center space here, which is called the pit for G.I. Joe, there's going to be a certain number of energy tokens that you're going to put here in order to revive any heroes that happen to fall during battle. This number will change based on player count, but for solo mode, it's always going to be 4. You'll also want to have the Mission Critical power board nearby, but I'm going to go over this later when I discuss vehicles, because this is going to be where you're going to see and use your vehicles for the whole game. For now, let's go to the deployment phase so you can see the universal deployment system in action. The deployment phase works exactly the same as it does in Heroes of the Grid. You're going to take the top card of your deployment deck, flip it over, and resolve the foot soldiers and locations from what you see on the cards. However, for the universal deployment system, this is all represented by the tokens you've been placing during initial setup. First, you're going to look to see how many of what type of foot soldiers you are deploying. Either 1, 2, or 3, and either the red or yellow foot soldiers. Then you're going to look at the top of the next card on the deck to determine the location, which is one of the 4 tokens that you placed earlier, and then you're going to take the figures from the stack matching the symbols shown and place them on the location with the matching hex. So for this example, we're shown 2 yellow Cobra symbols. We've assigned the yellow Cobra token to the Cobra troopers, so this is telling us we need to take 2 Cobra troopers and place them in the location with this symbol, the secret base. So you would take these 2 and then they would go right here. Very simple, very easy once you see how it all connects together. And again, this makes the variability of the game increasingly greater, because all of these symbols and all of these cards and these tokens will be different every time you play. And as you can see, none of these foot soldiers are directly tied to any card within this deck. They can go to virtually any location on the board during the initial setup. So for example, I could have easily had this over here. Let's move these guys out, and then these would have been switched. It's the exact same flip, it's the exact same card read, but now we're taking 2 Crimson Troopers and they're starting over here at the laboratory instead of 2 Cobra Troopers starting at the Cobra Temple. That is the type of variation that you're going to get every single time you play with the Universal Deployment System. Each deployment phase consists of flipping over 5 cards from the deployment deck. So we have this one, the next one would call for 3 Crimson Guards going to the research lab, which is right here. Number 3 would be 2 Crimson Guards going to the jungle laboratory. Next would be 3 Cobra Troopers going to Space Station Delta. And finally, your 5th card would be 1 going to the secret base, which is at the Cobra Temple. Once the 5th card has been resolved, you're going to take all 5 cards, you're going to shuffle them together, and they are going to go to the bottom of the deployment deck. So this way, should you happen to make it to round 5, then the deployment deck will be ready to go for you as you proceed through the game. I added a few more here just to give this example, but the thing that you should really remember is figure limit on each spot. Right now, they are 5 for the Cobra Temple, 6 for the Space Station Delta, 5 for New York, and 6 for the Jungle Laboratory. Meaning that the Cobra Temple is completely full, and that is a panicked location. Should a figure need to go into this spot later on, they move clockwise around the board until they're able to fit into a spot in the next available location. So he would actually, if I had to put this one guy into the Cobra Temple, he would then go over to Space Station Delta. Page 7 of the Mission Critical Rulebook shows the hierarchy to placing figures down on the board, meaning that there's a priority order that you would go in depending on what you reveal during the deployment phase. That would be bosses, followed then by any Nemesis figures, followed then by lieutenants, and finally foot soldiers. So as you deploy these figures, these are the order that things go in. And of course, always remember, no matter what, it doesn't matter how many figures are on a board, if a Nemesis, a lieutenant, or a boss land in an area, it is immediately panicked. So if you've completed the deployment phase, everything is out over here. We're now into the action phase of the game, which again is going to be basically exactly the same as Heroes of the Grid. Each action you have is going to grant 1 action. Those actions are move, moving spaces around the board, recovering, taking up to 6 shields worth of cards from a discard pile and shuffling back into your main deck and regaining an energy if you don't have one, and then battle, which is engaging enemies at locations. All preparations, card draws, card placement, turn order, all of that stuff is exactly the same as you would have in Heroes of the Grid. So those battle systems and everything work hand in hand precisely as with each other, except that the Joes do not have Zords, they have their vehicles. So why don't we go ahead and take a look at the Joe's power board and go over exactly how they work. Vehicles are powerful tools in the Joe's arsenal, and each one of them will provide a unique special ability, but at a cost. The power board here has spaces for a draw pile for your vehicles, where the face-up vehicles go, and I'll talk about all that in a moment, where your foot soldiers will go as you defeat them, and a space that you can store your energy. The base game comes with 6 vehicles, so what you're going to do is you're going to take all 6 of those and shuffle them together and place them face down into here. I believe this works exactly the same as Heroes of the Grid, where every game you play, you should only have 6 vehicles. So if you happen to have more vehicles through promotions or expansions or whatever, you would either handpick or randomly choose 6 of them to create your deck. Everyone out there, if you happen to know something else, if you're allowed to have more than 6 vehicles in your pile, please let me know. I don't see why not, but it can bog down the vehicles themselves because you'll actually be going through this pile a few times during the course of your game, so maybe there'll be certain vehicles you like better than others that you would like to see again. In any event, for this example, after I have shuffled the 6 vehicles together and placed them face down, you're going to take the top 3 and you're going to place them on these spots next to the draw deck. And these are going to be the initial vehicles that your team has access to during battles. Unlike Heroes of the Grid, the Joes do not level up and earn their vehicles that way. Instead, they have access to whatever is shown face up here right from the beginning of the game, right from the beginning of the first battle they go through, but they need in order to defeat foot soldiers and spend those foot soldiers in order to activate whatever vehicle they choose. When battling foot soldiers, every time you defeat one, you're going to place the figure on this grid-shaped space here on the power board. The more foot soldiers you defeat, the more options you're going to have in order to be able to get different vehicles during the course of your battle. At any point during the battle, and this does not count as part of the hero's turn, this is a completely free action, a vehicle can be activated by spending the amount of foot soldiers on the track equal to the number in the upper left-hand corner, returning the foot soldiers to the supply and then triggering whatever the power of the vehicle is. Some vehicles are quick and easy, like this 2-cost ram right here, where you would just have to spend 2 in order to trigger its effect. Others are a little bit more expensive, like the Mobat, where you're going to need 5 foot soldiers in order to trigger it, but you can also earn them through the course of the battle and then trigger it later. In any case, once a vehicle has been resolved, you're going to remove it and put it in a discard pile off to the side of the board here, and you will not replace the one that you just used. The empty spots are only refilled during the battle cleanup phase, which is basically at the end of a battle. So if this was the cleanup phase, you would then take the top card and just place it in here, filling up the row. Quick thing to note, some vehicles do have passive abilities. If purchased during battle, the passive ability triggers and will stay active for the remainder of that battle. Once you hit the battle cleanup phase, the card that you purchased that had the passive would then go into the discard pile. If you need to refill vehicles and there's no more in the deck spot over here, just take what you have in your discard pile, give them a good shuffle as you would for any new things going to refill a deck, place that back over here, and then refill as normal. So this is why I said maybe 6 vehicles is the best to have for each one, because if you have too many vehicles in here, you're not going to be cycling through them as fast as you would hope, because you want to be able to get all the foot soldiers out in order to be able to use these vehicles, but then you're not going to refresh them again until this pile is empty and you need to refill the spots up here. Thing to note, there are only 10 spots on the G.I. Joe power board for enemy figures. That means if all the spaces are full and you defeated a foot soldier, instead of it going to the power board, it would go back to the supply instead. You would lose out on being able to use that for a vehicle, meaning do not hold back on your vehicle usage, use them or lose them. In Heroes of the Grid, whenever you defeated a monster or a nemesis figure, you immediately leveled up and gained a Zord. For Mission Critical, after defeating a lieutenant or a nemesis, instead of them being added to the power board, the player gets a vehicle token. You're going to place this symbol side up somewhere on the power board, and the heroes may then use this at any time during the game in order to get a vehicle for free. When activated, the token is then spent, so you can flip that over to the back, and then either return to the supply or left face down, and then the heroes can choose any one of the vehicles to trigger for free without paying the cost of any of the foot soldiers down in the bottom. Meaning that you only get 2 of these throughout the course of the game, because these would only grant 1 token apiece. So each lieutenant would grant 1 when you defeat them, and each nemesis would grant 1 whenever you defeat them. So spend them wisely, but again, do not hold back too much because you never know what's going to show up next in your vehicle boards. All right, let us talk crossover. Mission Critical is fully compatible with Heroes of the Grid, along with any future Guardian System games that Renegade puts out. Transformers! This means that you will have even more ways to play and different combinations of heroes and rangers and villains and monsters that you can try out depending on how many sets that you have and the more that you get for your collection. Speaking of titles, there are certain words and terms that appear in both games that are actually interchangeable with each other. For example, Ranger is the same as Hero, so cards that reference any one of those will apply to the other, meaning that if something says a Ranger may do something, then that means a Hero could do it as well. Hero is a generic term for the player's characters, and the same will go for other characters that you would find throughout the course of the game. These two symbols right here represent foot soldiers. Again, these are interchangeable. Anything that references foot soldiers will apply to either cards with this symbol on it or the ones with this one. Over here we have monsters and lieutenants. These are two interchangeable terms that you have through the games. Nemesis cards work the same for both systems as well, but it's a symbol here for the Nemesis on Heroes of the Grid and here for Mission Critical. But again, Nemesis are the same. And then over here we have the bosses. We have the boss symbol for Heroes of the Grid and the boss symbol for Mission Critical, along with action tokens. They may look slightly different between the two, but they'll always have an arrow on one side that's lit up and then dark on the other to show the use of an action. And then in G.I. Joe Mission Critical, they have this lightning bolt here for energy, whereas in Heroes of the Grid, it's a crystal. Doesn't really matter. It's still energy, regardless of however you look at it. Same thing for first player tokens. There's a first player token for Heroes of the Grid, and there's a first player token right here for Mission Critical. It doesn't matter. Whoever has the leader token as you have assigned for the beginning of your game will be taking whatever card action triggers when it references the leader of your team, the leader of your rangers, the leader of your heroes, however you want to see it. As far as the deployments go, this is where things really get fun. As explained earlier, the Universal Deployment System allows any 2 foot soldiers to be deployed in any 4 locations. If you wish to use one Heroes of the Grid foot soldier, so for example, I would use Putty Patrollers, I can have them here as one of my 2 foot soldiers, and then maybe just like Cobra Troopers, the basics of all basic foot soldiers for both Heroes of the Grid and Mission Critical. You could also use 2 from Mission Critical. You could use 2 from Heroes of the Grid. This is literally anything that you could use at this point because it doesn't matter because they are not tied to their locations. Speaking of which, you have your 4 locations here that came in Mission Critical. You can swap them out however you want with any location you happen to have from Heroes of the Grid. So that can just go here. So KO35 can be part of this particular game. Now, there is something you do have to keep in mind when adding new locations. You can add any location you want from your collection, but bear in mind there are a few that do have 4 as a limit for the amount of figures that can go in, and then 7 as well as the Stone Quarry here. I don't think that there's a number limit that you need to have in order to be able to fit foot soldiers around here, but I would guess the higher the number you have, the easier it would be because less spaces would panic, whereas the lower the number you have, the harder it would be. If you had everything from Heroes of the Grid, you would have 2 locations with 4 count and 2 locations with a 7. So if you wanted like a really hard game, I would say take the 2 locations that have 4s on them and put 1 here, and then 2 locations with 5. So that's the minimum amount of foot soldiers that can be in the middle at any time. Conversely, if you want a longer game, or at least an easier game, there are 2 locations with 7. Put 2 locations with 6 and 2 locations with 7 on there. So this way, more foot soldiers can populate the field and you don't have to worry about things panicking as fast. This is the amazing part of the Universal Deployment System. You can have this in any order, in any way you want, no matter what characters you have. And remember, when choosing foot soldiers from Heroes of the Grid, you do not need their deployment tech cards. You just need their combat cards, because the foot soldiers you choose are not tied to any one of these particular locations. Instead, as I explained before, you're still just going to put the different symbols around the board here, and then your universal deployment deck, which you're going to shuffle together and put down, will work the same. You're going to assign one of the 2 symbols to whatever foot soldiers soldiers you have, and then when that's revealed, that's when they will start populating the field. It's really that simple, it's really that awesome, and I really hope to maybe see different symbols or whatever come out maybe in the future, something Heroes of the Grid related, so this way you can use the universal deployment system for Heroes of the Grid should you not have Mission Critical. Then again, you can always make your own tokens as well and homebrew it. Either way, this is a great addition to the game and really adds even more variability. Again, as mentioned before, when you go through the action phase, everything else is the same. The recovers are the same, the battles are the same, the movement is the same. And I mentioned to you what terminology are interchangeable with each other for the course of the game. However, the two things that are not interchangeable are vehicles and Zords. But you can use both in your game should you have a crossover with the Joes and the Rangers. Using the power board, you're going to make your stack of vehicles as explained earlier, and you're going to make a stack of Zords that you're going to put over here the same way that you would for in Heroes of the Grid. Meaning that you're going to take 5 Zords of your choice, usually tied to whatever Ranger you're going to be playing as, shuffle them together, and then you're going to take a Megazord figure and put that on the bottom. You're going to take this stack of 6, put it right next to the vehicles over here, and then once you put down the vehicles for your playthrough, the next thing you're going to do is you're going to take the top card of the Zords and you're going to flip it over. So you actually can see what the next Zord is that you are trying to acquire. Even in crossover, whenever you defeat a foot soldier, they will go to the power board right here. You place them on any one of these little sections right here. Again, it doesn't really matter where you do. I'm just putting them in random places just to show that you can do it. But remember that once you have all 10 filled, then you cannot place any more on the power board. At any point during the game, you can then purchase the top Zord from this deck for 6 foot soldiers. So if I wanted this Mastodon, I would then have to remove 6 foot soldiers from the board, and the Mastodon would then be in my possession. These would then work as any other Zord would from Heroes of the Grid, meaning that they would go here to activate their ability, you would exhaust them, and you would then be able to use this in future rounds, because at the beginning of the next phase, or the beginning of the next round, I should say, they unexhaust and you're able to use them again. Once you have purchased one, you're then able to flip over the next card, and once again, should you have 6 foot soldiers, you can then purchase that as well. This also goes for the vehicle tokens that you earn for defeating lieutenants, nemesis figures, and monsters. If you have a crossover going with G.I. Joe and Heroes of the Grid, if you were to defeat a monster, you get a vehicle token. You do not immediately get a Zord. However, if you wish to, you can spend the token in order to acquire a Zord for free without having to purchase it using these 6 foot soldiers from your board down here. And finally, should you happen to go through all of the deck and you have the Megazord left, this can be purchased the same way as any other Zords. You would have your 5 Zords in reserve here in order to be able to do whatever their abilities are, once per activation, once per round, and then you could spend 6 foot soldiers or a vehicle token in order to acquire the Megazord. But again, as always, you just have to keep in mind with this because each one of the vehicles will have their own cost to them as well. So it's a balancing act, how many Zords you're going to get, how many vehicles you're going to use, and that's how it is with the crossover games. You have to determine which one would work better for what situation, how much you have to purchase, and how it's going to make your game absolutely amazing. Just keep in mind, and I mentioned this at the beginning talking about Zords and vehicles, the words Zords and vehicles are not interchangeable. Anything that references vehicles from the G.I. Joe cards only affects their vehicles. Same for Zords. Anything that affects a Zord card, whether it be unexhausting it or doing some other special ability to it, only affects the Zords. This is the one time when these two are completely separate, but there's still plenty in the game in order to be able to work the two of them in conjunction and pull off some amazing combos in order to take down the enemies. Lastly, I want to talk about what happens when all locations panic. In Heroes of the Grid, this is an immediate loss. This is just something that happens when all locations panic. You are immediately game overed. That is it. Mission Critical did introduce the Last Stand mode, and you can use this in your Heroes of the Grid game, in your crossover game. It doesn't matter. At the point when your board has a full panic during the deployment phase, you're going to go to your command center and remove every single piece of energy from it. that means that you still have until the end of that round in order to unpanic any areas. Should the whole board repanic and you cannot remove any energy from the center, this is when you have officially lost the game. But you also have to watch out as well, because if a hero happens to fall during battle and you cannot remove an energy from here in order to revive them, then that is also a lose condition. Basically, you're just keeping an eye on the energy that is in the center here, in the pit, in your command center, and whatever you want to call it. And as soon as there are none left, you have to watch out, because if it goes to remove any more, the game is immediately over. When setting up your game, regardless if you're doing a crossover or Heroes of the Grid or Mission Critical, you can choose right at the beginning if you're going to be going with this mode where you immediately lose if everything is panicked, or if you're going to be initiating the last stand mode for your game. I personally think that the last stand mode should be a thing that happens for every game, because it does give you a chance in order to clear out the sections and really make sure that you stick around and everything, and it's the constant threat of having no energy in the middle. But that is all up to you and how you wish to play your games. And there you have it, the universal deployment system, how the vehicles work for the Joes, and of course, how to get that epic crossover between G.I. Joe and Power Rangers. I hope this helped clear up anything that you might have had questions on in regard to how these things, mix together and possibly adding something to your collection, combining them, or anything along that ways. But remember, this also works for every future Guardian system release. So if something new comes out for the Guardian system, there's going to be a very similar crossover ability between that and, of course, G.I. Joe and Power Rangers. If you still have any questions in regard to G.I. Joe Mission Critical, by all means, please leave them down in the comment section below, and I'll get back to them as soon as I can. I will be doing a playthrough of the game in the future, depending on how things go and my timing and whatnot, but you will also see breakdowns of the Joes, starting with the core set, coming very soon. But now I want to hear from you. What do you think of G.I. Joe Mission Critical? Do you like the new ways that they do the vehicles and everything? Do you like the universal deployment system? Would you like to see Renegade put out maybe an upgrade kit in order to let us access this type of system for Heroes of the Grid? Of course, if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe to the Home Gamer Dad so you don't miss any future Mission Critical action or any other fun videos I happen to put out for you to enjoy. If you wish to support the channel even further, a super thanks is always welcome. That would be absolutely amazing. Or you can go ahead on over to patreon.com/homegamerdad, check out the tiers available there, and possibly join the growing Patreon family. In any event, you watching this video, giving it a like, sharing it, commenting down below is absolutely fantastic with me. I love it. It just is great things for all of us, and I thank you from the bottom of my heart. As always, take care of yourselves and each other. We are family forever, gaming together. Until next time, when I break the Joes down into a much more detailed run, and then of course, leading up to that ever important, amazing session that we're going to have with them, Joes versus Cobra, you guys take care, and I will see you in the next one.